Dr. I'm just going to quickly introduce Dr. Urquhart. So Dr. Urquhart is an Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs, Professor of Biology for Lyman Briggs College and the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife for Michigan State University. Dr. Urquhart is a tropical biologist who studies coupled natural and human systems and has over 25 years of experience working in the tropics. He teaches in both Lyman Briggs College and Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. He began teaching at MSU in 1999 and has taught courses ranging from biology to computer science to study abroad. In his research, Dr. Urquhart is most interested in understanding the synergistic effects of globalization and climate change as the last wild places on Earth become more influenced human activity. The majority of his work has focused on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, but he has a new NSF-funded project in the Brazilian Amazon. Dr. Urquhart leads study abroad programs to Nicaragua and Ecuador, and his study abroad programs, he works to emphasize the human condition and teaching about rainforests as a place where humans and wildlife coexist. Before working at Michigan State University, he received his bachelor's degree from Lyman Briggs Michigan State University in zoology, his PhD from the University of Michigan, and held a postdoctoral research position at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. So at this time, I'll hand over the floor to you, Dr. Urquhart. And I'm so excited for your presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And today I'm going to focus on tropical rainforests and climate change. This is related to work that I've been doing over the last 30 years. And before I do that, I just want to give you a little bit of a background as to who I am. You got some of that from the biography there, but that's me in the bright green shirt with the big rubber boots, kind of halfway up the tree there, with some of my coworkers in Nicaragua and some students who worked with me. I've been doing work over 30 years now in tropical rainforests and other tropical ecosystems. And as Kaylin said, my undergraduate degree was from Michigan State University through a program called Lyman Briggs College, and I studied zoology there. I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, and while I was there, I held a fellowship from the US Department of Energy on global change. And for those of you who go to the Math and Science Center, my roommate in graduate school, the first year I was there, was Dr. Durango. Slides, there we go, now it's advancing. So you can't give a talk about tropical rainforest without a few pretty pictures of the plants and animals that live there. Some things that really captivate the imagination. And whether it's things like the scarlet macaw, or, and my slides are not advancing properly, or poison dart frogs. There's amazing things in tropical rainforests that we just, until you see them with your own eyes, are hard to imagine. Our dream of a tropical rainforest is something like this. This is a river in Ecuador flowing through an unbroken tropical rainforest. This area would have a biodiversity on a scale that you would have trouble imagining. And I'll show you some of those numbers a little bit later, but this area is something that's rare now when we think about tropical rainforests. Unfortunately, there's a great crisis with deforestation in the tropical rainforests, and that will be one of the things that I talk about as I talk about tropical forests and climate change. So just to orient, as we look at the tropical forests, these two lines represent the tropics, and those darkest green regions in the area within that area are the tropical rainforests. So you can see Central Africa, you can see South America, Central America, and then the South Pacific. And way over to your right, you'll see the Philippines, that cluster of islands in the northern part of that. And there's a lot of rainforest in the Philippines where our earliest speaker was from, and immense biodiversity found in the Philippines. So just to give you a quick outline, I'm going to talk about biodiversity in tropical rainforests, then move on to deforestation, talk about the water cycle, cyclones, and then thinking about how tropical rainforests can be a tool to help us fight climate change. So the importance of tropical rainforests almost seem like cliches. The biodiversity, staggering numbers of species, its importance in the global water cycle. And one of the key things that's often overlooked is how important it is as a home to indigenous and traditional peoples. So I'll start off with, I'm going to talk about that tropical biodiversity. When we first talk about biodiversity, we think about species richness. And that simply counts of how many species are found in an area. And this is highest in the tropics, whether it's tropical rainforests or coral reefs in the tropics. Now, put things in perspective. In an area in Ecuador, the size of 2 football fields, so shown here in that picture, you see 2 football fields side by side. There were 644 tree species surveyed in one area that size. 644 tree species. And if you take that area and you expand it a little bit to be, say, the size of a typical high school campus or a larger high school campus, you'll find more tree species in that area than in the entire United States and Canada combined. So take a second to think about that in an area that size, think about your high school or maybe the square mile that you live on, and it won't even be a square mile, but there are more tree species in an area that size in Ecuador or other parts of the Amazon than in the entire United States and Canada combined. We want to look at animal biodiversity and birds. And we have 20 million square kilometers in the United States and Canada, and about 900 bird species. Michigan, 145,000 square kilometers and about 350 regular occurring bird species. Now you look at Panama, it's 75,000 or 76,000 square kilometers and over 1,000 bird species. Okay, so that's 1/263rd the size of the United States and Canada, but more bird species than found in that immense area. This biodiversity is really impressive. Trying to advance my slide. And this pattern holds true if we look around the world and we see the places where the highest number of bird species is. It's areas like the west coast of South America, at basically the foothills of the Andes, some of the areas in Africa, and those areas have very, very high biodiversity. And there's an area in Ecuador, it's the size of, say, a typical county in Michigan. And in that side area, there's 959 bird species found. So that number in a typical county in Michigan, you'd be lucky if you saw 100 if you went over many years looking at that area. Now, the other part is in tropical biodiversity to think about is what's called endemism. And endemic species are species that are unique to a geographic area. And in Michigan, we have very few endemic species, but Kirtland's warbler, at least historically, was a species that was endemic to Michigan. It was the only place that it bred. Now with its population expansion, it's started to breed in a few other areas, but the Kirtland's warbler is a great example of an endemic species. In the tropics, there are many endemic species. So here you can see how many species in one of those areas are unique only to that area. So those areas in Western Ecuador on the west coast of South America there, those areas have, in an area the size of a typical Michigan county, 89 species that are only found in that particular area. Okay. So that's a really large number of birds that have a very small range. What this leads to then is if that area of rainforest is lost, you may lose all 89 of those bird species. So you can see that there are really these high levels of biodiversity, and this high level of endemism makes them very vulnerable to species loss. As we look into the future and we look at areas where there's going to be land use change and impacts of climate change. So these areas, the red shows where land use change will change what land cover there is, and the green is where climate change will cause changes in what land cover there is by the year 2100. You can see a mix of human land use change and climate change there. And this shows then the resulting declines in bird species. And one of the things that's really alarming here, a place that's often overlooked, is the African tropics. And you can see in the African tropics, and this shows the number of bird species that will have range declines of over 50% of their area. So that type of a range decline is often something that can lead toward species going extinct. And so in that area, you can see that there's a high likelihood of species being driven toward extinction. And as we look at this kind of at a global scale, this is for vertebrate species, the importance of these areas in terms of biodiversity. And what you can see are that there are key areas. The South Pacific has a lot of areas where there's very high biodiversity importance. Central and South America have very large areas, and some areas in Africa have very important biodiversity. So given that, the next thing I want to talk about then is what is going on in terms of loss of tropical rainforests and what those impacts will be then. So we've seen really an increased deforestation since 1980, or sorry, since 1950. And really in around 1980, it really started to accelerate as roads were built in the Amazon and more deforestation occurred. And one of the things that happens with forest loss is you get localized climate change that then can spread over a larger area. So I'm going to show you some maps. I apologize for the poor quality of this one here. I'll show you some satellite images, but what you'll see in it is some pink areas that represent deforestation. The lightest colored areas represent deforestation. The darker areas represent forest cover. You'll see little patches of forest that are fragmented. And I want you to look at those in this time series. So here we have 1983. This is an area in Western Brazil. And if you look over to the right side, you'll see a river that runs through that. And you kind of track what happens in that area along the river. But the pinkest area there, that pink line that goes from top to bottom, is the highway. And those lines that go off to the side that are pink are roads along which people are constructing farms. So that's 1983, it's 1993. Now you can see that so much of the area is pink that you start to lose track of where that original road is. You start to lose space between the horizontal lines, and then you see off to the left that another area of deforestation has sprung up. And then let's go back to that 1996. And then as we look at 2003, you can see that even more of that area has been deforested. And this is a wave of cattle ranching that occurred as roads were built into the Amazon and people began to raise cattle. And cattle are a very unproductive use of tropical rainforest land. You get very little productivity out of cattle ranching in tropical rainforests. So there were some things that initially made people think that forest loss might not impact certain areas of the world as much. So, for example, in the neotropics, the South American tropics, usually when people do logging, they just cut down a few of the tree species and only a few tree species are removed, and a lot of the forest is left there to recover. And the same holds true in Africa. And this is because in those forests, there's such diversity and a lot of the species don't have commercial value. Now in the Asian Pacific tropics, they practiced something very different. They practiced clear cutting, which had a very significant impact on the land. And that clear cutting was because many of the species there had high value, so it made more sense to just cut everything down. And so those areas experienced things differently. Now, that was great when it was simply logging was the main threat, but really the main threat today is agricultural expansion. And that affects all of these areas with some similarity, because usually when things are cleared for agriculture, they clear large patches of land. We can look at tropical forest cover loss from 2001 to 2017. So it's been essentially the major part of your lifetimes. And you can see that it has increased over that time. And currently we're losing somewhere on the order of around 15 million hectares. Hectares are the size of 2 football fields, so 15 million of those per year. In the Amazon, the deforestation, as I said, it started with this idea of selective logging, and that really doesn't cause a lot of deforestation, and forests will grow back. But the problem is that what has replaced it was land use change for cattle ranching, and that still remains one of the major drivers. But really what's happened in the last 15 years is an expansion of soybean production in the Brazilian Amazon, and that has really caused a lot of deforestation. This illustrates Brazilian rainforest cover in the Amazon as of 1996. And we're going to look now in a little more detail at some of this. And so you can see that the Brazilian Amazon in a given year, 4.5 million hectares of rainforest loss, about 1/5 the size of Michigan in a given year. For a long time, Brazil's trajectory for deforestation had been going in the right direction. And recently, with a new government in Brazil, it has gone quickly in the wrong direction. Let's see, I think the next slide is out of order. Well, I guess I'll cover this now and we'll get to this in more detail. So why is this a problem? There are lots of problems, the loss of biodiversity, but how does this relate back to climate change? And here we can see that a single hectare of tropical rainforest, again, two football fields in size, may hold 360 metric tons of carbon dioxide, right? So if we think about that, when Brazil loses 15,000 square kilometers in a given year, that's 540 megatons of carbon dioxide. So half of a gigaton of carbon dioxide released from the loss of that tropical rainforest. You can see that's a massive input of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So here we can see satellite imagery that shows the current state of the Amazon basin. And I'm going to then look at some other aspects of what's going on in that area. And lost the slide. So let's look at the global water cycle, and especially the water cycle in tropical rainforests. You've learned this probably repeated times since second grade, the idea of evaporation, precipitation, runoff, absorption by trees, evapotranspiration, and kind of a cycle that occurs there. So as we look at this and we think about the Amazon basin and we think about water in the Amazon basin, so one key thing when you learn about the tropics is that here in the Midwest, we have winds that typically come from the west to the east. When you go into the tropics, the winds go from east to west. So what you have is you have water blowing off of the Atlantic Ocean into the Amazon basin. and it carries a lot of moisture with it. So right along the coast there, you have pretty heavy rains, and we'll just track kind of that lower rain cloud. And what happens then is that water falls. It is absorbed by the trees. It eventually evaporates through evapotranspiration. And after it does that, it falls further inland. So that same water that fell on that first area of forest evapotranspirates, gets back into the atmosphere, and falls again further inland. And that pattern repeats. And so you have water moving its way across the Amazon, essentially being recycled and reused as it moves its way across the Amazon. Now, that worked great when this was continuous rainforest throughout the area. But you can see in that area where that first arrow starts, Maraba in Brazil, that there's actually a lot of deforestation. So what that does is when that rain falls there, there's not a lot of trees to absorb the water. Without trees and plant cover to absorb the water, a lot of it flows out through runoff, and you end up with rivers that become dirty. They dump sediment loads into the Atlantic Ocean, and they carry that water that was supposed to recycle and move inland, back out to the ocean. And so then the arrow of water that's available for evapotranspiration and recycling becomes much less, and the rainfall as you move inland becomes much less. And you can see that if you look at this and you pile this on top of it, that you have a repeating pattern as you move inland, that there's less and less water. Now, what can be the impacts of that? So tropical rainforests, because they're so wet, have historically been very fire resistant. And it was very unlikely that forest fires would occur in tropical rainforests. What they found is that there's been a great increase in the number of forest fires in the tropical rainforest in Brazil in recent years due to this localized climate change that's occurring because of kind of a break in the water cycle due to deforestation. And if we look at the northern shield of South America, you can see that there's a lot of forest fires that occur in those areas. And the pink represents recent or past deforestation, the yellow is current deforestation, and the red is areas where fires have been detected. So you can see that again, that there's a lot of increased fire. The area I work in Nicaragua has had a lot of recent deforestation and a lot of past deforestation, and that there is also fire that is increasing in severity and increasing in frequency in that area too. All right, so let's tie another thing related to climate change back to tropical forests, and that's cyclones. So cyclones are hurricanes and typhoons, and they can have major impacts on tropical rainforests. What led me to work in tropical rainforests in Central America initially was the impact of Hurricane Joan on the forest there. And the hurricane came in and flattened 500,000 hectares of tropical rainforest. And we looked at then over the next decade how that forest was growing back. And interestingly, our earlier speaker talked about taking cores to look at history. And one of the things I did in my project was I took cores of sediments from lagoons in the area and looked for a history of hurricanes, and found that hurricanes did occur in the past. And what happened after them in the past is that they led to these cycles of fire and regrowth that lasted for up to 500 years. So instead of a rainforest growing back quickly, sometimes in some areas, it would get into a cycle of fire and regrowth. It would take a long time for that to grow back. All right. Now, there's some things about cyclones, and one of them is that And this is a well-written headline, actually. It says, climate change is probably increasing the intensity of tropical cyclones. So tropical cyclones, it's hard to understand all of the physics and all of the dynamics of them. And to our best ability, we have pretty solid evidence that there's an increase in the intensity of these tropical cyclones due to climate change. Now, cyclones come out of areas of low pressure that rotate, and they get their energy from the ocean and the warmth of the ocean. And so warmer oceans lead to more intense cyclones. In the Western Hemisphere, we call these hurricanes. In the Eastern Hemisphere, they call them typhoons. And I always get typhoon and monsoon mixed up, but monsoons are just seasonal rains, whereas typhoons are tropical cyclones. So kind of to look at this, you get warmer ocean waters lead to essentially more fuel for a hurricane. Then you have heavier rains, and those heavier rains lead to a higher storm surge. And again, you can also add in rising sea levels, increasing that storm surge. All right. And here we can see the warming of the tropical Atlantic Ocean. You can see that on average, it's risen a little over 2 degrees, or around 2 degrees from its level in 1910, and about 1 degree higher than it was in 1950. So you can see, and this is degrees Fahrenheit, that there's been a warming, an overall warming of the ocean there. And here you can see percent of all hurricanes that are major hurricanes, that are really super intense hurricanes. And you can see that that number is increasing now. And again, that they are getting stronger. And so the strength, that we have more category 3 to category 5 hurricanes now than we did before. The number of hurricanes actually fluctuates in a way that's not necessarily related to climate change, but the intensity, we do think there's a pretty strong signal of climate change in that. So why they're becoming a bigger problem. So just some things, as scientists talk about this, one of the things that they've done is really focused on how confident we are about things. And this has had some positives and negatives, but I do like the approach to say, how confident are we that something is happening? And so this one says, tropical cyclone rates are projected to increase in the future due to anthropogenic warming and accompanying increase in moisture content. And we have medium to high confidence that that is going to happen. The intensities globally are expected to increase. And again, medium to high confidence there. Sea level rise, we know that sea level rise has been driven by human activity, and higher coastal flooding levels will lead to, or higher coastal sea levels will lead to higher flooding inland. And this image that you see to the right there is a really interesting image that you actually can see 4 tropical storms kind of in a line in sequence. You see one that's kind of off the coast of Africa, almost out of your vision, one that's off the coast of Brazil, one that's in the central Atlantic, and then one that has made landfall near the Yucatan Peninsula. All right. So there's a couple pieces of how tropical forests and climate change work together, or how climate change is going to impact tropical forests or vice versa. But one of the things we often overlook is the ability of tropical forests in our fight against climate change. So this is a group of students and me. I'm the one with the binoculars there. That's my younger years. And we're standing in front of not an old temple or something like that, but actually a massive tree in Panama. So this is a ceiba tree. It's also called a kapok tree. And it's one of the largest trees in Central America. They'll grow to 80 meters, so around 250 to 260 feet tall. And they have these immense buttressed roots that will go 30 to 40 feet and spread in a main trunk that can be 10 to 15 feet in diameter. This is a massive chunk of stored carbon dioxide. And that's an important thing as we think about tropical rainforests as a tool to combat climate change. So carbon sequestration is what means the storage of carbon, and tropical rainforests have a great capacity for the storage of carbon. The highest net primary productivity in the tropics or in the world occurs in the tropical rainforest, and that net primary productivity is a measure of how fast an ecosystem can accumulate carbon. So if we want to grow trees to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the best place to do that is in areas where tropical rainforests grow. And again, 360 metric tons of carbon dioxide can be stored in a single hectare of tropical rainforest. And so we can do a good job of at least pulling a lot of the carbon dioxide that was caused by deforestation out of the atmosphere by regrowing tropical rainforests. And I think that that's one of the key things, and that's one of the areas I've been trying to shift my work into as I go forward, is finding ways to work actually on reforestation. Because if you look here at our satellite image of South America, with all of the areas that are pink there, all of the areas that are red and yellow, there is a lot of area where tropical rainforest could be regrown, and that could lead to a lot of carbon sequestration. As we think about carbon sequestration, our daily activities emit carbon dioxide, loss of forest emits carbon dioxide, but growing forests will absorb that. And that's where we want to go to in the future. There's also some other impacts of reforestation in the rainforest that people don't think about, but they are really important in addition to offsetting the carbon dioxide emissions. But poverty reduction is something that can result from this, even paying people to grow trees for simply the sake of storage of carbon would greatly reduce the issues of poverty in global south. And that is not something, not a trivial part of this, because if we want these things to work, we do need to think about ways to make it economically incentivized. And 20 years ago, there was a lot of movement toward creating carbon offsets. And in 10 years ago, that started to decline, people's interest in doing carbon offsets. But I think that as we move toward the future, that's going to be very important to think about how we can do reforestation and carbon sequestration. So the area that I did my graduate research in, while I was doing the work on looking at how the forests were going to regrow from the hurricanes, the village that I worked in, it was basically a group of one large family and all their children and grandchildren. And they had a reforestation project. And so I was able to watch them as they did that and then visit the area 15 years later. So these are the trees in plastic bags waiting to be transported into the forest and planted, or actually transported into the fields. They were reforesting agricultural fields. And this is that area 15 years after they planted those trees. And you can see that this is starting to look like a rainforest. In 30 years, it will have very high levels of biodiversity. And even at 15 years was starting to be a very important place for birds and other species in the rainforest. So I was excited after years of being on that farm and not seeing toucans very frequently, to start to see them again in that reforested area. So some keys to the future as we think about it, that as we try to think about saving the rainforest and also combating climate change, that we really do have to consider the role that humans play in that, and especially local people. Too often, decisions are made in the north here that impact the global south without really thinking about the importance of the people that live in those areas. One of the things that has happened is a lot of communally managed areas in these rainforests have been deforested. And if we can protect those, we can stop further deforestation. And we can also allow the people who have lost their communally managed lands to reclaim them and reforest them. And in the indigenous village I work in Nicaragua now, there's a great interest in this and reclaiming their traditional lands and growing trees back in them. And so the idea of carbon offsets. So again, 15 years ago, there was a pretty strong movement to have carbon offsets. So when you bought a plane ticket, they would offer you carbon offsets for the carbon dioxide that your flight would cause. And then they would purchase an area of rainforest for reforestation, for example, as a way to do that. And that's something I think that we really need to revisit as we go forward. And finally, with that, I'm just going to wrap up and ask you if there are any questions. And I see that there are a few things that popped up in the chat there, so I'll check those out and be happy to answer any additional questions that come up. So let me
I can start reading them off to you. So okay. The first one we have is, when it comes to trees and forestry being good for carbon sequestration, what is your advice for large urban areas like cities and stuff like that? Yeah, so there is good potential there for growing forests in, and so, the idea of moving towards cities with more green space is important. So that's one possibility. The other, and they haven't done this as much in hot tropical areas or the moist tropical areas, but things like green roofs and just increased green space in general, but green roofs, roof gardens, things like that would be another way. The second question there I see is, how did I get involved in research abroad? So I actually wanted to do research in Michigan. When I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to study small fish in Michigan. And I met a professor who was doing research in Nicaragua. And at that time, I had just come out of the Earth Day 1990 activities, and I led those on MSU's campus. And really had a great passion to do something that actually made a difference rather than just studying a fish that, was actually probably the most abundant fish in Michigan, the bluegill. And so I started to talk to him, and I ended up eventually going with him to Costa Rica and then to Nicaragua, and spent most of the 1990s then living in Nicaragua. So as the person says, knowing what is going on with Bolsonaro in Brazil, what can we do here to help the forest? So for those who don't know, Jair Bolsonaro is the new president of, well, not new, but recently elected president of Brazil. And a lot of people had difficulties with the recent presidency we had here in the United States. My Brazilian friends say that that's nothing compared to what they're going through in Brazil right now. In North America, I don't know how much there is that we can do with helping Brazil overcome what has gone on with Bolsonaro, and how long it's going to take
how long it's going to take to really undo some of the effects of the policies that he's put into place. He's really encouraged a lot of deforestation, a lot of agricultural expansion, and that takes a long time to reverse. So again, one of the biggest problems I have, though, is us in the United States thinking that we can solve Brazil's problems, because in reality, it needs to be Brazilians that solve Brazil's problems. And what we can do is support those Brazilians rather than trying to come in as this enlightened North American person with all the solutions. So one of the things I would say is try to connect to climate activists in Brazil and see what they, ways in which you can help them. So the next question about do reforestation products adequately replicate the diversity of a forest they're supposed to replace, and how to address that? So yeah, there are some issues with reforestation. Historically, reforestation has been done very specifically with high value tree species that often are not native to the area, and often they're planted in monocultures. And so there's almost no biodiversity in a lot of the historical reforestation projects. You bring in a bunch of teak trees that are native to India into South America or Central America, and you plant a plantation of teak, and you actually end up with erosion problems. It's not really any biological or biodiversity-wise different than a cornfield. Modern reforestation techniques are really trying to address that, and there have been a lot of cool advances in Costa Rica and Panama trying to explore use of native species or mixtures of native and non-native species, but in a mosaic that creates a habitat that's very diverse, and then leads to a much higher biodiversity. Now, to truly replace that biodiversity is something that probably will take centuries, but we can start by building a diverse forest as the base and hope that the diverse species that depend on those tree species will come and join. Mr. Muick asked me, is going on trips to visit the rainforest worth it, considering the effects of the flight? So this is it's a kind of a catch-22, right? We want to go and we want to see these places and learn and become smarter about them. But then you're flying 2,000 miles on something that burns a lot of fossil fuels. And, so you have to think about that. The other part of that is, you're spending thousands of dollars to go live in a rainforest for a week or 2 weeks. And then you can look at what are the ecological impacts locally of my being there versus not being there. And then what are the benefits of you being there? So if you do these kind of activities, one of the things that can be really important is to look for ways to travel to the rainforest that support local people. So it means not booking a trip through, say, a European-owned travel agency that owns, that does trips to Costa Rica, but rather looking at locally owned lodges, locally owned places where that money actually will stay in the local economy, because you do have the climate change impact that you need to think about, but there's also the economic side of it. And if you can provide positive economic stimulus in these rainforest areas, that greatly reduces the likelihood that they're going to be cut down and shifted into agriculture. So that's an important thing to consider as you think about, do I want to travel to the rainforest? And if I do, how do I do it in a way that helps support local people? One of the things that I've tried to incorporate into some of the study abroad programs I've done is involvement of local students as well. and so that it's not just American students learning about the rainforest, but it's students in Nicaragua getting the chance. And even though they grew up in these areas around the rainforest, they may not be from families that have had a lot of wealth to go travel to these areas. So we take students from a university in Bluefields, Nicaragua, to a rainforest that's about 50 miles away from there, and almost none of them have ever been to that area of rainforest. And so that's one way in your travel that you can do things. And if you ever, get the chance to actually lead people going to a place like that, think about ways to have local people not only be kind of tour providers, but also be on the tour with you. And then of all the places I've done research on forestry, which has been my favorite, I do have to say that Nicaragua really is my favorite. I spent, 5 years there, living there most of the time. I have several families there that I still am really connected to. I have several villages that I've visited in the last 15 years with a newer research project in Nicaragua that I'm still trying to find ways to support things like their reforestation efforts. It's an amazing country. Unfortunately, it has a political problem that's almost as bad as the Bolsonaro problem, or maybe worse than Bolsonaro, but not as large scale. In that the president that they have now, who was a leftist leader in the 1980s, came back in 2007 as the president and found a way to make himself lifelong president, and has essentially become a dictator, exactly the person that he pushed out of the area. And so he, in 1979, led a revolution to get rid of one dictator. Now, 40 years later, he's the spitting image of that dictator in terms of his political policies and everything. That makes it impossible for me to do research there. And in fact, they just recently passed a law that took away MSU's ability to do business in Nicaragua. We're still trying to figure out what that means, but that is something that's going to impact my ability to do research there going forward. And I currently have a graduate student who's from Nicaragua, and I don't know what's going to go on, as far as his research and whether he's going to have to distance himself from MSU to continue to do his research there. All right. So Mr. Muick told me something about students in the class really struggle with whether it's okay to go see glaciers before, and wanted to give them some perspective, like, what does it mean to travel? Like, what do our own personal lifestyles mean to these areas that we want to go visit and learn about and see? And so things you can do, though, are to look into things like purchasing offsets. And there still are places that sell carbon offsets and tropical reforestation. And so that's something that you can always do with your projects. And along with that, I always encourage people to kind of make a commitment to, I'm not going to just let this be some fad that I did in high school or as an undergraduate in college, but I'm going to make a lifelong commitment to trying to be a person that contributes positively to the planet. And some people do that through helping other people. Some people do it through helping the environment. There are many ways that you can do that, but it is something that to really think about. I have a son who actually, in his upcoming job, is going to make a very large amount of money, more than I ever imagined. But he is somebody that will be his tool then to help make a difference on the planet. And it'd be nice if there were more people that had those large amounts of money that would be willing to contribute that. But since, you're mostly high school students without much money, activism is your route and engagement is your route, and trying to find ways that you can do travel to these areas or engagement with these areas in ways that doesn't have a serious negative impact. I'm glad that's actually an important question for all of you. So are there any further questions?
I'm not seeing any in the Q&A currently.
Okay, good.
I just want to thank you so much for coming today and giving your presentation. It was very interesting. And I'm very glad that we were able to have you today. At this time, we are going to take a break for lunch, so there will be no programming until 1. And at 1, we will have the 3 sessions back open again for the next speakers coming in. So please stay tuned and come back for those. And thank you, Dr. Urquhart, again for presenting for us today.
You're welcome. I hope to come to the school sometime and actually get the chance to visit.
Yes, that would be awesome. We would greatly appreciate that. I'm sure Dr. Durango would love